On June 12, 1913, the surveyors found the shoes arranged side by side beneath a limestone overhang on Lonesome Ridge. They were small shoes, sized for children no older than 8 or 9. The leather had been modified with industrial reinforcements, metal eyelets that belonged in mining boots, soles wrapped in strips of canvas and tar. The wear patterns told a different story than abandonment: smooth depressions on the inside heels, the kind that came from months of constant use. Inside each shoe, carved into the leather with something sharp, were initials that matched no missing persons report filed in Harlan County. Were these shoes left behind by children who escaped, or by someone who wanted them found? Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time it is right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Also subscribe the channel for more such stories. Now, let's continue with the story. In the summer of 1913, the 3 men who discovered the shoes were surveying timber boundaries for the Cumberland Logging Company, mapping property lines along ridges that few people traveled. The lead surveyor, Harold Kenny, would later testify that his first thought upon seeing the shoes was that some family had cached supplies there, perhaps planning a return trip that never happened. The mountains were full of such remnants: forgotten tools, abandoned campsites, the debris of transient lives. But these shoes troubled him in ways he struggled to articulate to the county sheriff 3 days later. They had been placed deliberately, not dropped or discarded, positioned with care beneath the overhang where rain and snow would not reach them. The limestone shelf formed a natural alcove, protected on 3 sides, the kind of place someone might choose if they wanted something preserved. First to draw his attention were the modifications. Kenny had worked in timber camps across 3 states and recognized industrial craftsmanship when he saw it. The leather strips reinforcing the soles came from heavy-duty material, the type used in equipment harnesses or mining gear. Someone had punched additional eyelets into the uppers, 8 pairs instead of the standard 4, allowing the shoes to be laced tight to the ankle. The canvas wrapping at the toe suggested protection against repeated impact. These were not modifications a parent would make for a child's Sunday shoes. These were alterations designed for hard labor. Deepening the unease were the wear patterns. The inside heels showed erosion consistent with months of daily use, the leather compressed and smoothed by constant friction. The toe boxes bore scuff marks that spoke of kneeling, of crawling through confined spaces. One shoe had a repair patch near the arch, crude stitching that suggested fieldwork rather than a cobbler shop. The initials were found by Kenny's companion, Robert Thacker. He had picked up one of the shoes to examine the sole when he noticed the carving inside. ID scratched into the leather lining with what looked like a nail or piece of wire. The other shoe bore matching marks, OD. The location itself posed questions that none of the surveyors could answer satisfactorily. Lonesome Ridge sat 14 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by foot through terrain that challenged experienced hikers. The ridge formed part of a natural boundary between Harlan County and the Virginia border, a landscape of steep hollows and dense timber that discouraged casual travel. No child could have walked 14 miles through that country in winter conditions. The surveyors agreed on this point when they discussed it that evening at their camp. Even in favorable weather, the journey would require knowledge of the land, physical endurance, and equipment beyond what any 8-year-old possessed. Yet the shoes suggested exactly that kind of journey. The wear, the modifications, the careful preservation all pointed toward children who had traveled far beyond normal childhood boundaries. When Kenny delivered the shoes to Sheriff Thomas Gentry's office in Harlan on June 15, 1913, the sheriff examined them with visible reluctance. He turned them over in his hands, studied the initials, measured them against his own palm. Too small for adolescence, too modified for ordinary use. Gentry asked a single question that Kenny remembered clearly decades later: "How long do you reckon these were out there?" Kenny considered the preservation, the protection from weather, the lack of animal disturbance. Could be months. Could be longer. The overhang kept them dry. What Gentry did not tell the surveyors was that those initials matched a case he had closed 16 months earlier. 2 children reported missing in February of 1912, last seen wearing cloth shoes unsuitable for winter travel. The investigation had lasted less than a week. The assumption had been death by exposure, bodies to be recovered during spring thaw. But spring had come and gone. Summer had followed. And now these shoes suggested something far worse than a quick death in the mountain cold. They suggested survival. They suggested labor. They suggested children walking much farther than anyone had thought to search. The question that haunted Gentry, the question that would eventually drive him to reopen a case he had gladly forgotten, was simple and terrible. If Ida and Opal Ducker had survived long enough to wear through industrial modifications on their shoes, where had they been? And more troubling still, who had modified the shoes in the first place? Virgil Ducker waited 72 hours before reporting his daughters missing. A delay that would raise questions only in hindsight. The twins vanished on February 9, 1912. Ida and Opal Ducker, 8 years old, identical in appearance according to the sparse description their father provided. Last seen playing near the cabin in the late afternoon, gone by nightfall. Their father claimed he assumed they had wandered to a neighbor's property and would return by morning. When morning came and the girls did not, Virgil told the county clerk he began searching the immediate hollows himself. He checked the creek bed a quarter-mile south, walked the ridgeline to the east, called their names into the thick stands of pine that surrounded the property. This occupied the 10th and 11th of February. Only on the 12th did he ride into town to file a report with Sheriff Gentry. The sheriff's initial notation, preserved in county archives until the courthouse fire of 1937, recorded basic facts without editorial comment. *2 female children, age 8, disappeared from family residence 4 miles southeast of Cumberland Gap. Father states last seen February 9 at approximately 4 in the afternoon. Children were wearing everyday clothes, cloth shoes, no winter coats. That final detail should have prompted immediate questions. February in the Kentucky mountains meant temperatures dropping well below freezing at night. Snow still covered the ground in shaded hollows. The kind of cold that killed the unprepared within hours, not days. But Gentry asked no questions about the delay. He organized a search party, standard procedure for missing children, and treated Virgil Ducker with the deference typically extended to concerned fathers. The possibility that 3 days of mountain winter might have already rendered a search futile seemed to trouble no one on record. The Ducker cabin sat in isolated country, accessible by a rough track that became impassable during heavy rain. Census records from 1910 listed the family at this address, though the enumerator noted difficulty reaching the property. 4 miles from the nearest settlement meant genuine isolation, the kind that shaped mountain life in ways town dwellers rarely understood. Neighbors were distant concepts in such terrain. The closest occupied dwelling belonged to the Hackett family nearly 2 miles northeast along a ridgeline path. The Hacketts would later tell a county investigator that they had not seen the Ducker girls in weeks, possibly months. Mountain families kept to themselves, particularly in winter. Virgil described his daughters in terms so generic they could have fit dozens of children in Harland County, small for their age, dark hair, brown eyes. He could not remember what clothes they had been wearing beyond the cloth shoes. He stated they had no distinguishing marks or scars. When pressed, he admitted he could not recall the last full conversation he had held with either child. This portrait of paternal distance might have seemed unusual in another context, but Sheriff Gentry had worked in mountain communities long enough to recognize patterns: large families, subsistence living, fathers worn down by poverty and isolation, often relating to their children as additional labor rather than individuals. Sad perhaps, but unremarkable. The detail about the shoes, however, should have resonated differently. Cloth uppers with thin soles were summer footwear at best. In February, such shoes amounted to negligence bordering on abuse. Yet Gentry's report contained no mention of this discrepancy, no notation questioning why a father would allow his daughters outdoors in inadequate footwear during winter. The search itself followed predictable patterns. 11 men gathered on February 13 to comb the immediate area. They covered perhaps 3 square miles over 4 days, focusing on places children might logically reach: creek beds, nearby clearings, the woods within a mile radius of the cabin. They found nothing. No torn fabric caught on branches, no small footprints in the remaining snow, No signs of disturbance that might indicate a struggle or accident. The mountain had apparently swallowed 2 8-year-old girls without leaving evidence of their passage. Contemporary theories among the searchers ranged from animal attack to simple exposure. The local newspaper, the Harland Enterprise published a brief notice on February 18, 2 children missing in county. Search continues. The article occupied 4 column inches on page 7. No follow-up appeared in subsequent editions. What the searchers and the newspaper failed to address was a question of basic survival. How could 2 children in cloth shoes survive even the first night of February cold? The temperature on February 9 had dropped to 18 degrees according to weather records kept by the Cumberland Gap station. The 10th was colder still. 3 nights in such conditions without proper footwear, without winter coats, without shelter should have meant bodies found within days as soon as enough ground had been covered. But the search turned up nothing. No remains, no evidence of death, nothing to suggest where 2 children might have gone. Sheriff Gentry filed his final report on February 17, presumed dead by exposure. Bodies to be recovered during spring thaw if remains are locatable. Case suspended pending discovery of evidence. The speed of this conclusion was notable only in retrospect. A week from disappearance to case closure. No difficult questions asked. No investigation into why a father had waited 3 days to report his children missing. The system had functioned exactly as designed, which is to say it had processed a tragic but common occurrence with minimal disruption to other county business. Virgil Ducker returned to his cabin. The community forgot about Ida and Opal with the ease that came from never having known them well in the first place. Spring arrived, then summer. No bodies surfaced. The case remained suspended, gathering dust in a filing cabinet until the day Harold Kenny walked into Gentry's office, carrying 2 small shoes that had been modified for purposes no one could immediately explain. The 3-day delay suddenly looked less like a father's desperate search and more like a father's careful calculation, time enough for trails to go cold, for evidence to disperse, for the mountain to erase whatever had really happened to 2 children whose names he could barely remember. Census records told one story about the Ducker household. But neighbors who actually visited the cabin remembered something different. The 1910 federal census conducted in April of that year listed the Ducker family at their residence 4 miles southeast of Cumberland Gap. Virgil Ducker, head of household, age 31, occupation listed as farmer, Sarah Ducker, wife, age 28. 6 children ranging in age from 2 to 12 years. But when investigators reopened the case in 1913 and began interviewing neighbors, a pattern emerged that contradicted the official record. The Hackett family, living closest to the Duckers, could recall seeing only 4 children on the occasions they encountered the family at the general store or crossing paths on ridge trails. Mary Hackett specifically remembered this because she had once asked Sarah Ducker about the age gap between her eldest and youngest, trying to make conversation as mountain women did. Sarah had seemed confused by the question, Mary told investigators. She had hesitated before answering, then changed the subject entirely. Other neighbors reported similar discrepancies. A family living 3 miles west remembered 4 children at a church gathering in 1909. The shopkeeper in Cumberland Gap kept informal tallies of families for credit purposes, and his ledger from 1910 showed the Duckers purchasing supplies consistent with a household of 4 children, not 6. The census enumerator for that district had died in 1912, making it impossible to question his methodology. Census workers in rural areas often relied on information provided by the head of household without independent verification. If Virgil Ducker claimed 6 children, the enumerator would have recorded 6 children. The question was why a man would inflate the number of his offspring for an official government record. One possibility centered on land claims and homestead provisions. Certain federal programs allocated resources based on family size. A man with 6 children might qualify for assistance or land grants unavailable to a man with 4. But investigators found no evidence that Virgil had applied for such programs. Another explanation proved more disturbing. If 6 children had existed at some point, but only 4 remained visible by 1910, what had happened to the missing 2? Infant mortality in mountain communities ran high. Disease, accidents, and inadequate medical care claimed many children before their 5th birthday. No one kept comprehensive death records in unincorporated areas. A child could be born, live briefly, and die without any official documentation beyond perhaps a grave marker. But the Ducker family plot, such as it was, contained only one small grave, Sarah's mother, buried in 1906, according to the wooden cross that marked the spot. The household underwent a significant change in the autumn of 1911. Sarah Ducker died in childbirth on October 14. The baby did not survive. The local midwife who attended the birth, Eunice Starling, later described it as a difficult labor complicated by Sarah's poor health. Mountain women often bore too many children too close together, their bodies worn down by malnutrition and constant pregnancy. Virgil buried his wife in the family plot. The midwife attended the burial along with perhaps a dozen neighbors. The children stood at the graveside, 4 of them by every account given to investigators years later. The twins, Ida and Opal, had been 7 years old at the time. An older boy, name unremembered by most witnesses, a younger girl, perhaps 5. Within a month of Sarah's death, Constance Farley moved into the cabin. The speed of this arrangement raised eyebrows among neighbors. Constance was a widow herself, her husband having died in a logging accident 2 years prior. She had been living with her brother's family in a settlement near the Virginia border, working as a housekeeper to earn her keep. How Virgil came to know her well enough to invite her into his household so soon after his wife's death remained unclear. Some neighbors speculated they had known each other before Sarah's death. Others assumed it was simply practical necessity. A man with 4 children and no wife needed help, and a widow with no prospects needed security. Constance was described by those who knew her as quiet, efficient, and notably distant with the children. She did not attend church functions or socialize with other mountain women. When she did appear in town for supplies, she spoke only as necessary and avoided lingering conversations. The Hackett family visited the Ducker cabin once in December of 1911 to bring a ham for Christmas, a gesture of charity common among mountain families during winter. Mary Hackett later recalled that Constance answered the door and accepted the ham with minimal gratitude. The children were not visible. Constance explained they were sleeping, though it was mid-afternoon. Mary remembered noticing that the cabin looked different than it had during Sarah's life. Cleaner perhaps, but colder, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. By January of 1912, the Ducker family had effectively withdrawn from what little community contact they had maintained. Virgil no longer attended the occasional gatherings at the settlement church. The children stopped appearing at the general store. The family became, in the words of one neighbor, like ghosts who lived on the mountain but weren't really part of it anymore. This isolation made the events of February 9 harder to verify. When the twins disappeared, no one had seen them in weeks. No one could say with certainty when they had last been observed alive and well. The investigation relied entirely on Virgil's account, and Virgil's memory of his own children was notably vague. The census discrepancy haunted investigators who looked into the case years later. 6 children in 1910, 4 children seen regularly by neighbors, 2 who vanished in February of 1912. The mathematics suggested something beyond tragic coincidence. Whether those missing children from the census had died naturally in the intervening years, whether they had been sent away to relatives, or whether something more deliberate had occurred remained impossible to determine from the fragmentary records available. What was certain was that the Ducker household operated under conditions of severe isolation, poverty, and dysfunction. Children in such environments existed in a gray area beyond the reach of teachers, doctors, clergy, or law enforcement. They could disappear and barely leave a trace. Their absence noted only by the few neighbors who happened to keep count. The search party that assembled on February 13, 1912, numbered 11 men, a respectable turnout for an isolated mountain community in winter. Sheriff Gentry organized them into pairs, assigning sections of terrain radiating outward from the Ducker cabin. The strategy followed standard practice for missing children: start at the last known location, work outward in expanding circles, focus on natural features that might attract or trap young wanderers, creek beds where children might go to play, hollows that offered shelter from wind, rocky outcroppings that could conceal a fall. The men who participated ranged from neighbors like Samuel Hackett to townsmen who had never met the Ducker family but felt obligated to help in a crisis. Mountain communities operated on mutual aid. You searched for a neighbor's children because someday someone might need to search for yours. They covered roughly 3 square miles over 4 days. The terrain resisted easy movement, steep slopes, dense thickets of mountain laurel, deadfall timber from past logging operations. February weather added complications. Temperatures hovered below freezing, making long days outdoors a test of endurance. Snow remained on the ground in shaded areas, complicating the search for tracks. But the searchers found nothing. No footprints in the snow beyond the expected radius around the cabin. No torn fabric caught on branches at child height. No disturbed ground suggesting a struggle or accident. No traces of the twins at all. This absence of evidence should have raised more questions than it answered. 2 children do not vanish from a fixed location without leaving physical traces. Even in the best circumstances, even with deliberate effort to conceal movement, something remains: a disturbed rock, a broken twig, scuff marks in leaf litter. The searchers discussed this among themselves during breaks. Samuel Hackett later recalled the general puzzlement. They had expected to find bodies fairly quickly, given the inadequate clothing and winter conditions. Dead children from exposure typically did not travel far from their starting point. Yet the search turned up nothing within a mile of the cabin. Some participants suggested animal predation might explain the lack of remains. Mountain lions still inhabited the most remote sections of Kentucky wilderness. Bears, though typically hibernating by February, could be encountered. Either predator might take a small body and leave little behind. But animal attacks usually left signs at the kill site: disturbed ground, blood traces, torn clothing. The searchers found none of these indicators. The ground around the cabin and along the most likely paths looked undisturbed beyond normal winter conditions. Another theory held that the twins had fallen into a sinkhole or cave opening, common features in limestone country. Such a fall might hide bodies effectively, particularly if snow or debris had subsequently covered the opening. But the searchers checked every visible depression within the search radius and found nothing. By the 4th day, enthusiasm had waned. The men had jobs and farms that demanded attention. 4 days represented a significant commitment of time and labor. Without results, without even promising leads to follow, the search felt increasingly futile. Sheriff Gentry made the decision to suspend active searching on February 17. His reasoning, recorded in county documents, reflected a grim pragmatism common to law enforcement in rural areas. The children had been missing for 8 days in winter conditions. If they had died from exposure, as seemed inevitable, their bodies would be recovered during spring thaw. When snow melted and ground became more accessible, continued searching in February served no practical purpose. Dead children would wait. Living children in cloth shoes could not have survived 8 days of mountain winter. This conclusion satisfied the search party. They returned to their farms and businesses with the understanding that the case would resolve itself come spring. No one suggested expanding the search radius beyond 3 miles. No one proposed checking with neighboring counties to see if the twins had been spotted elsewhere. The investigation effectively ended 1 week after the twins disappeared. No reward was posted for information. No regional alert went out to law enforcement in surrounding areas. The Harland Enterprise published its brief notice and moved on to other news. What made this quick closure remarkable was not its occurrence, but its typicality. Missing children in isolated communities rarely received extended attention unless bodies appeared or evidence suggested foul play. The assumption of death by exposure provided a tidy explanation that required no further investigation. Sheriff Gentry filed his final report using language that had closed dozens of similar cases, presumed dead by exposure. Bodies to be recovered during spring thaw if remains are locatable. Case suspended pending discovery of evidence. The phrasing was notable for what it implied. If remains are locatable suggested Gentry expected the mountain might keep its secrets. Not all bodies surfaced. Animals scattered remains. Weather and terrain complicated recovery. The sheriff had created bureaucratic space for the case to remain forever unresolved without reflecting poorly on his office. Spring came. The snow melted. Searchers who happened to be in the area kept an eye out for small bones or torn clothing. Nothing appeared. By summer, most people had forgotten the Ducker twins ever existed. The search that lasted 4 days represented the full extent of official effort to find 2 missing children. 11 men covering 3 square miles. No follow-up investigation. No questioning of why the children had been outdoors in inadequate clothing. No examination of Virgil Ducker's 3-day delay in reporting them missing. The system had functioned exactly as it was designed to function, which meant it had processed a tragedy with minimal disruption to normal county operations. 2 children vanished into administrative closure as efficiently as they had vanished from the mountain. Only 16 months later, when Harold Kenny carried 2 modified shoes into Gentry's office, did anyone realize how thoroughly they had failed to ask the right questions. 3 separate families reported seeing the Ducker twins alive in the months after Sheriff Gentry declared them dead, but none of these accounts made it into official records. The first sighting came on March 23, 1912, 6 weeks after the twins disappeared. Edgar Sutton, who operated a general store in Cumberland Gap, later told his wife about 2 girls who had come into his shop with a man he did not recognize. The details stuck with him because the girls behaved oddly. They did not speak, did not ask for anything, simply stood near the door while the man purchased tobacco and flour. Sutton described them as twins, approximately 8 years old, wearing clothes that looked too large for their frames. Their shoes caught his attention specifically, not the cloth shoes typical of poor mountain children, but sturdier footwear, possibly modified boots cut down to fit smaller feet. The man paid in cash and left quickly. Sutton thought nothing of it at the time beyond noting he had never seen this particular customer before. Only later, when his wife mentioned the Ducker case during conversation, did he make a possible connection. By then, weeks had passed. Sutton could not recall the man's features with any precision. Medium height, dark coat, hat pulled low. The kind of anonymous description that fit hundreds of men in the region. He never reported the sighting to Sheriff Gentry because he assumed he must have been mistaken. The Ducker twins were dead. Everyone knew that. The second sighting occurred in early April near Pineville, roughly 30 miles from the Ducker cabin. A woman named Charlotte Vance, traveling by wagon to visit relatives, passed another wagon heading in the opposite direction toward the Virginia border. She happened to glance at the passengers and saw 2 small girls seated in the back, partially obscured by cargo. What made her remember this encounter months later was the girls' expressions. Blank, she told a county investigator in 1913. Not frightened exactly, but absent, like they were somewhere else entirely, even though their bodies sat in that wagon. Vance had also noticed an older woman driving the wagon and a man walking alongside rather than riding. This struck her as unusual. Wagons typically carried all passengers unless the load was particularly heavy, but this wagon appeared to have room. Again, Vance did not report what she saw because she had no reason to connect it to the Ducker case. She learned about the missing twins only much later, after the modified shoes surfaced and newspapers published more detailed accounts. The third report came from within Harland County itself. A farmer named Joseph Feary claimed he saw 2 girls matching the twins' description working in a vegetable garden behind a property he did not recognize. This occurred in late May, 3 months after the disappearance. Feary had been cutting across unfamiliar territory on his way back from checking trap lines when he spotted the children. They were hoeing between rows of beans, supervised by a woman he could see only from a distance. Something about the scene troubled him. The girls moved mechanically without the usual energy of children doing outdoor work. He nearly called out to them, but decided against it. Mountain folk valued privacy, and trespassing on another family's property to ask questions about their children could create bad blood between neighbors. Like the others, Feary only connected what he saw to the Ducker case after the fact. By the time he thought to mention it to anyone, he could no longer locate the property. He had been cutting through dense woods at the time and could not retrace his path with certainty. When these accounts finally reached Sheriff Gentry in late 1913 during the reopened investigation, he dismissed them with a notation that appeared in his expanded case file, Multiple sightings reported of children resembling missing subjects. Witness reliability questionable given time elapsed and prevalence of similar appearing children in region. No credible evidence of survival. This dismissal reflected both practical reality and bureaucratic convenience. Mountain communities were indeed full of poor children who looked alike: dark hair, slight builds, threadbare clothes. Distinguishing one set of twins from another based on brief glimpses months after the fact would be nearly impossible. But the consistency of certain details should have warranted more attention. Multiple witnesses mentioned unusual behavior: girls who did not speak, who seemed disconnected from their surroundings, who appeared to be under the control of adults. The modified shoes from Sutton's account aligned disturbingly well with the evidence Harold Kenny would discover on Lonesome Ridge. Sturdy footwear altered to fit children suggested someone had invested effort in keeping those children mobile and working. Perhaps most telling was the geographic pattern. Cumberland Gap, Pineville, and the unlocated property Feary described all lay along rough corridors that connected Kentucky to Virginia and Tennessee, transient routes used by people who had reasons to avoid main roads and populated areas. These corridors served legitimate purposes. Timber workers moved between camps following seasonal employment, traveling merchants sold goods in remote settlements, families relocated in search of better land or opportunities. But the same routes also facilitated darker commerce. Labor contractors recruited workers, including children, for operations that could not attract employees through normal channels. Unscrupulous individuals moved vulnerable people between jurisdictions to avoid legal scrutiny. Whether the sightings represented genuine encounters with Ida and Opal Ducker or simple cases of mistaken identity could not be determined with certainty. The witnesses were sincere in their recollections, but human memory is unreliable, particularly when months separate observation from reporting. What remained undeniable was that Sheriff Gentry had closed the case without seriously investigating the possibility that the twins might have survived their disappearance. The sightings, had they been pursued in real time, might have led somewhere. Roads could have been watched. Surrounding counties could have been alerted to watch for two girls matching specific descriptions. Instead, the reports gathered dust until they became historical curiosities rather than actionable leads. By the time anyone thought to follow up, the witnesses could offer only vague recollections. The trails, such as they were, had gone completely cold. Between February of 1912 and June of 1913, the Ducker family systematically removed itself from Harland County, leaving almost no documentation of their departure. The cabin stood empty by autumn of 1912. Neighbors noticed gradually rather than all at once. The property simply stopped showing signs of occupation. No smoke from the chimney during cold mornings. No laundry hanging on the line. The small vegetable garden went untended, weeds reclaiming the rose Sarah Ducker had planted the previous spring. Samuel Hackett walked over to check on the family in late September after noticing the prolonged absence. He found the cabin door standing open, the interior stripped of personal belongings. Furniture remained, being too heavy and worthless to transport, but clothing, tools, and kitchen implements had been removed. The place had the hollow feel of deliberate abandonment rather than sudden flight. Hackett asked around the settlement. No one had seen Virgil or Constance leave. No one had witnessed a wagon being loaded or observed the family traveling toward town. They had simply ceased to exist in the community, their departure as silent as the twins' disappearance months earlier. A property transfer document filed in the county clerk's office on August 6, 1912, provided the only official trace of the family's movements. Virgil Ducker sold his cabin and 4 acres to a timber company for $37, a price that suggested either desperate circumstances or quick negotiation. The document listed his destination as Evansville, Indiana, though no forwarding address appeared in the records. $37 would barely cover transportation costs and initial lodging for a family. The sale represented abandonment more than financial planning. Virgil was cutting ties with Kentucky entirely, trading property his family had occupied for years for enough cash to reach another state. What happened to the remaining Ducker children became clear only through scattered accounts gathered years later. The older boy, whose name appeared in no official documents related to the case, went to live with Virgil's brother somewhere in Tennessee. The younger girl was taken in by Sarah Ducker's sister, who lived near Lexington. Neither relative could be located for questioning when investigators reopened the case. The dispersal of these children followed patterns common in mountain families when parents died or abandoned their responsibilities. Extended family absorbed orphaned or unwanted children as a matter of survival and obligation. But the speed and thoroughness of the dispersal suggested planning rather than spontaneous charity. Someone had arranged these placements before Virgil left for Indiana. Someone had coordinated the timing so that all loose ends were tied up within months of the twins' disappearance. The most damning piece of testimony came from Mary Hackett, who had encountered Constance Farley in town during early August, shortly before the property sale. Mary had asked directly about the twins, the first time anyone had pressed Constance for information since the failed search. Constance's response, as Mary recalled it to investigators, was delivered without hesitation or emotion. They're living with their aunt in Tennessee. Better situation for them. Mary had found this odd for several reasons. First, it contradicted the prevailing assumption that the twins had died from exposure. If they were alive and well in Tennessee, why had no one mentioned this during the search or in the months since? Second, Constance provided no details about which aunt, what part of Tennessee, or how the arrangements had been made. Most troubling was Constance's demeanor. She offered the information flatly, as someone might report the weather, then changed the subject before Mary could ask follow-up questions. Mary did not think to question this exchange more deeply at the time. Mountain families frequently sent children to live with relatives when circumstances demanded it. The explanation seemed plausible enough, particularly since the alternative was believing 2 8-year-olds had survived months of winter without being found. But when the modified shoes surfaced 10 months later, Mary remembered that conversation with new understanding. Constance had lied. Whether the lie was designed to cover Virgil's tracks or whether Constance herself had been deceived remained unclear. No official records documented any children matching Ida and Opal's descriptions arriving in Tennessee to live with relatives. No letters appeared in family correspondence mentioning the twins' relocation. The story Constance told was apparently fabricated from whole cloth, designed to satisfy casual inquiry without inviting investigation. The 16 months between the disappearance and the discovery of the shoes represented a period of calculated erasure. Virgil eliminated his presence in Kentucky, scattered his remaining children beyond easy reach, and relocated to a state where no one knew about the missing twins. Constance provided a plausible cover story for anyone who asked questions, then disappeared herself. By the time Harold Kenny found the modified shoes on Lonesome Ridge, the Ducker family had fragmented beyond reconstruction. Virgil was somewhere in Indiana, Constance's location unknown. The surviving children had vanished into the vast network of rural relatives spread across 3 states. This dispersal was not accidental. It followed a pattern recognizable to investigators who worked child welfare cases in later decades. When adults had something to hide about children in their care, they made those children disappear into informal systems that kept no records and asked no questions. The twins had vanished in February. By August, Virgil had sold his property and left the state. By September, the cabin stood empty. By October, anyone searching for the family would have found no trace beyond a single property document listing a destination that might or might not be accurate. The system that had failed to search adequately for the twins also failed to notice when their entire family erased itself from the county. No one tracked Virgil's departure. No one verified Constance's story about Tennessee. No one wondered why a man would sell his property for a fraction of its value and flee to another state 6 months after reporting his children missing. The silence was complete, deliberate, and almost successful. It would have remained permanent if not for 2 small shoes carefully hidden 14 miles from where anyone thought to look. The limestone overhang on Lonesome Ridge had protected the shoes from weather for months, possibly longer, preserving evidence that should have degraded into nothing. Harold Kenny spotted them first on the afternoon of June 12, 1913. He and his 2 companions, Robert Thacker and James Polk, were mapping timber boundaries for Cumberland Logging Company, tedious work that required precise measurements and attention to natural landmarks. The overhang caught Kenny's attention because it represented a clear geographic feature useful for boundary marking. He approached to take measurements and saw the shoes arranged beneath the protective shelf of stone. 2 pairs positioned side by side with deliberate care, not dropped, not scattered by weather or animals, but placed as someone might arrange shoes beside a bed before sleeping. Kenny called the others over. The 3 men stood looking at the shoes without touching them initially, recognizing immediately that something about the scene was wrong. The size indicated children. No question about that. But the modifications told a different story. Kenny, who had worked in mining operations before taking surveying jobs, recognized the metal eyelets as industrial hardware. The leather reinforcement strips wrapped around the soles came from material used in equipment harnesses. Someone had invested significant effort and expense in altering these shoes. The location deepened the mystery. Lonesome Ridge sat 14 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only through terrain that challenged experienced outdoorsmen. The surveyors had been working this territory for 2 weeks and had seen no signs of recent human activity beyond their own tracks. No camps, no cleared paths, no evidence that anyone used this area for travel or logging. Yet here were children's shoes modified for hard use, carefully preserved beneath stone. Polk examined the terrain surrounding the overhang. The ground showed no disturbance, no indication that anyone had stood here recently. Whatever had happened, whatever had led to these shoes being left behind, had occurred months ago at minimum. Weather and seasonal changes had erased all traces except the shoes themselves. The protection offered by the overhang was nearly perfect. The stone shelf extended perhaps 3 feet out from the ridge face, angled to deflect rain and snow. Beneath it, the ground remained dry even after storms. Wind could not reach far enough back to scatter light objects. It was, in effect, a natural archive. Thacker picked up one of the shoes to examine it more closely. The modification quality was professional, not the kind of rough repair work a parent might do with available materials. Someone with access to industrial supplies and knowledge of construction techniques had reinforced these shoes specifically to withstand extended use. The wear patterns told their own story. The soles showed erosion consistent with walking over rough ground for extended periods. The toe areas bore scuff marks suggesting frequent kneeling or crawling. Most tellingly, the inside heels had worn smooth, the leather compressed by months of constant friction. These shoes had been used hard and used regularly. Children wearing them had worked, not played. That was when Thacker found the initials. Inside the first shoe, carved into the leather lining with something sharp, were the letters ID. The second shoe bore OD, carved with the same tool in what appeared to be the same hand. The 3 surveyors discussed what they had found. Over the next hour, they considered possible explanations that might make the discovery less disturbing. Perhaps the shoes belonged to children who had outgrown them and left them here while playing in the mountains. Perhaps they represented lost property from a family traveling through the area years ago. But every benign explanation collapsed under scrutiny. Children did not play 14 miles from settlements in terrain this difficult. Families traveling through this country would have no reason to modify shoes with industrial materials. And no one would carefully arrange discarded footwear beneath a protective overhang unless they intended it to be found eventually. The initials suggested ownership, identity marked in permanent fashion. Someone had wanted these shoes tied to specific individuals. Kenny made the decision to take the shoes to the county sheriff. His companions agreed, though none of them articulated exactly what they suspected. The modifications, the location, the careful preservation all pointed toward something deliberate and wrong. Whether the shoes represented evidence of a crime or simply an unusual coincidence, authorities needed to make that determination. They wrapped the shoes in canvas and added them to their survey equipment. The remainder of that day's work proceeded in relative silence, each man considering implications he preferred not to voice. The ridge itself offered no other clues. The surveyors searched the immediate area thoroughly, looking for additional items, disturbed ground, anything that might provide context. They found nothing. Just the 2 pairs of shoes preserved beneath stone, waiting for someone to notice. The journey back to town required 2 days. Kenny kept the wrapped shoes separate from other equipment, treating them with the kind of care normally reserved for valuable instruments. Some instinct told him these shoes mattered, that they represented more than abandoned children's footwear. On June 15, he walked into Sheriff Gentry's office and unwrapped the canvas on the desk. The shoes looked smaller in the confined space of the office, more obviously sized for young children. The modifications stood out starkly under indoor lighting. Gentry examined them without speaking for a long moment. Then he asked Kenny to describe exactly where they had been found and exactly how they had been positioned. The sheriff's face revealed nothing, but his hands were not quite steady as he turned the shoes over, looking at the initials carved inside. What Gentry did not tell Kenny immediately was that he recognized those initials. ID and OD matched the names of 2 children reported missing 16 months earlier. 2 children whose case he had closed with the notation *, presumed dead by exposure *. 2 children whose father had claimed they vanished in cloth shoes unsuitable for winter. Yet here was evidence they had survived long enough to wear through industrial modifications designed for hard labor. The shoes forced a reckoning with a case Gentry had considered settled, a tragedy filed away and forgotten. Now those 2 small pieces of modified leather demanded answers to questions he had never bothered to ask. Sheriff Gentry reopened the Ducker case on June 16, 1913. A decision that appeared in his ledger with a notation that revealed his discomfort with the entire situation. * Physical evidence recovered necessitates renewed investigation despite case closure. Modified footwear inconsistent with presumed death by exposure. The language was bureaucratic, carefully worded to avoid acknowledging what the shoes actually implied, that he had closed a case prematurely, that 2 children might have been alive while he filed paperwork declaring them dead, that someone had put those children to work in conditions requiring industrial modifications to their footwear. The modified shoes sat on Gentry's desk for 3 days while he considered how to proceed. The initials matched. The timing aligned with the 16-month gap between disappearance and discovery. But proving the shoes belonged to Ida and Opal Ducker required more than circumstantial connection. He started with the modifications themselves. The craftsmanship was too skilled for amateur work. Someone with access to industrial materials and knowledge of reinforcement techniques had created these alterations. That suggested specific industries, specific locations where such work might occur. Gentry sent descriptions of the shoes to newspaper editors in 3 counties, asking readers to examine the craftsmanship and report if they recognized the methods used. The Harland Enterprise * published the request on June 21 under a headline that finally gave the Ducker twins more attention than the original Disappearance had received. Modified children's shoes found on remote ridge, connection to missing twins investigated. The article described the leather reinforcement strips, the industrial eyelets, the wear pattern suggesting extended use. It asked specifically whether any cobblers, leather workers, or industrial operations recognized this type of modification work. The response came not from Kentucky, but from Virginia. A timber foreman named Douglas Craddock wrote to Sheriff Gentry on July 3, his letter preserved in case files that survived the courthouse fire. I have seen shoes modified in exactly the manner you describe. They are used in certain lumber operations where children are employed in work that requires them to navigate difficult terrain or crawl beneath machinery. The modifications protect small feet from the kind of damage that would render a child unable to work. I have personally witnessed this practice at several mills operating near the Tennessee-Virginia border, though such employment violates both state labor laws. The letter continued with details that Gentry found deeply disturbing. Children as young as 6 worked in these operations, performing tasks adults could not easily accomplish. They cleaned beneath heavy machinery, crawled through narrow spaces to retrieve dropped materials, carried water and supplies across rough terrain between work sites. The work destroyed ordinary shoes within days. Modified footwear represented a practical necessity for operations that relied on child labor. The industrial reinforcements were not kindness, but economic calculation. Replacing shoes cost money. Reinforcing them extended their useful life and kept children working longer. Craddock noted that enforcement of child labor laws in remote timber operations was functionally non-existent. The mills operated outside incorporated towns, often moving between locations to follow timber resources. No labor inspectors reached these areas. No schools existed to note children's absence. The workforce consisted of transient families desperate enough to bring their children along or of children obtained through less legitimate means. That phrase, obtained through less legitimate means, appeared in Craddock's letter without elaboration, but its implication was clear. Some children working in these operations were not there by family choice. Kentucky law prohibited employment of children under 14 in hazardous industries. The statute, passed in 1906, carried meaningful penalties for violations, but the law assumed enforcement mechanisms that did not exist in unincorporated territory. Labor inspectors worked in cities and established towns. They had no mandate or resources to patrol remote timber operations in mountain regions spanning 3 states. The gap between law and enforcement created space where desperate or unscrupulous operators could exploit vulnerable children with minimal risk of discovery. As long as operations kept moving, as long as they maintained distance from population centers, they functioned beyond the reach of authorities. Gentry cross-referenced Craddock's letter with information about Constance Farley, the woman who had moved into Virgil Ducker's cabin shortly after his wife's death. According to what Mary Hackett remembered, Constance had a brother who operated a boarding house near the Tennessee-Virginia border. The boarding house connection was significant. Such establishments in remote areas often served as informal labor exchanges, housing transient workers and connecting them with employment in nearby industries. A boarding house operator would know which mills employed children, which foreman asked no questions about age or family connection. If Constance's brother operated such a place, he would have been ideally positioned to facilitate the kind of transaction Gentry now suspected: 2 children delivered to his establishment, then placed with a mill operation that needed small workers for tasks adults could not perform. The financial arithmetic was grimly straightforward. Virgil sells his daughters to Constance's brother for cash. The brother places them with a mill operator who pays for child workers. The children's labor generates ongoing value while Virgil uses his payment to relocate to Indiana, beyond the reach of Kentucky authorities. This theory explained the 3-day delay before reporting the twins missing. It explained Constance's fabricated story about Tennessee relatives. It explained why Virgil sold his property for a fraction of its value and left the state so quickly. Most importantly, it explained the modified shoes found 14 miles from the Ducker cabin. The twins had been taken somewhere else, put to work in conditions requiring industrial footwear, and somehow those shoes had ended up on Lonesome Ridge. Whether the twins themselves had traveled to that ridge, whether someone else had left the shoes there, whether the placement represented escape or evidence disposal remained unclear. But the shoes proved survival, at least long enough for the modifications to show significant wear. Gentry began the difficult work of trying to locate Virgil Ducker in Indiana and Constance Farley wherever she had gone. He sent inquiries to law enforcement in surrounding counties, asking about boarding houses near the border and mills known to employ children. He requested that regional newspapers publish descriptions of the twins in case anyone recognized them. The investigation had finally begun in earnest. 16 months too late to make a meaningful difference. The truth about what happened to Ida and Opal Ducker emerged not from Sheriff Gentry's investigation, but from an unrelated labor dispute heard in a Tennessee court in March of 1914. The case involved a furniture manufacturing operation accused of violating wage agreements with adult workers. During testimony, a former employee named Ruth Penland described conditions at the mill where she had worked during 1912 and early 1913. She mentioned the boarding house where workers were housed, operated by a man named Calvin Farley, near the town of Jellicoe, just across the Kentucky border. The name caught the attention of a court clerk who had read newspaper accounts of the Ducker case. Farley was not a common surname in that region. The clerk sent a transcript of Penland's testimony to Sheriff Gentry, noting the possible connection. Penland's testimony painted a picture of an operation that existed in the gray spaces between legal commerce and outright exploitation. The furniture mill employed perhaps 30 people at peak production, housing them in Calvin Farley's boarding house and deducting room and board from their wages. The arrangement was not unusual for remote industrial operations. Workers lived where they worked, bound by debt to their employer. What made Penland's account relevant to the Ducker investigation was a single passage in her testimony, offered almost as an aside when describing the various workers she had encountered. There were children working in the mill during my time there. I saw twin girls, very small, perhaps around 8 years old, maybe younger. They worked beneath the heavy machinery, cleaning sawdust and retrieving dropped materials. The foreman said they were relatives of Mr. Farley, but they called no one family. They kept to themselves entirely. The court had not pursued this detail. The labor dispute involved adult wage agreements, not child employment practices. Penland's observation went into the record without additional questioning. But for Sheriff Gentry, reading the transcript in April of 1914, the description aligned too precisely with the Ducker twins to dismiss as coincidence. Twin girls, approximately 8 years old, working in a furniture mill connected to a boarding house operated by someone named Farley. The timeline fit. The location fit. The connection to Constance Farley seemed undeniable. Gentry traveled to Jellicoe in late April to investigate further. He found that Calvin Farley's boarding house had closed in late 1913. The furniture mill had relocated to a different county following timber resources, as such operations typically did. Farley himself could not be located. Neighbors said he had left Tennessee months earlier, destination unknown. The mill's current operators, when questioned, claimed no knowledge of previous employment practices. They kept no records from before their acquisition of the equipment. The worker housing that had existed near the old mill site stood abandoned, already deteriorating from neglect. Gentry managed to locate Ruth Penland and interview her directly. She provided additional details that had not appeared in her court testimony. The twin girls, she remembered, worked primarily during early morning and late evening hours, times when fewer adult workers were present. They wore modified boots, she recalled, sturdy footwear that seemed disproportionately heavy for their size. The girls spoke rarely, Penland said. When they did speak, it was to each other, not to the adults around them. She could not recall their names. Calvin Farley had introduced them simply as his nieces, and no one questioned this explanation. Penland remembered their demeanor as notably subdued. They did not play or display the energy typical of children their age. They moved through the mill with mechanical efficiency, completing assigned tasks without supervision. Several workers had remarked on this at the time, finding it unsettling to watch such young children work with such grim purposefulness. The work itself, Penland explained, was necessary but unpleasant. Sawdust accumulated beneath the heavy sawing equipment where adults could not easily reach. Dropped materials needed to be retrieved to prevent machinery jams. Small hands proved useful for these tasks. The mill employed the twins because their size made them efficient for work adults could not perform comfortably. Whether the girls were paid for this labor, Penland did not know. She assumed Calvin Farley handled any financial arrangements. The girls lived at the boarding house, ate meals there, and were transported to and from the mill by Farley himself. Penland had worked at the mill from March through September of 1912. She left to take employment elsewhere and had no knowledge of what happened to the twins after her departure. When asked if she had reported seeing children working in industrial conditions, she looked genuinely confused by the question. It was not uncommon, she told Gentry. Many mills use children for certain tasks. I did not think it warranted reporting at the time. This response reflected the reality of early 20th century labor practices in remote industrial operations. Child labor laws existed on paper but lacked effective enforcement mechanisms in areas beyond the reach of labor inspectors. Children worked alongside adults as a matter of economic necessity or exploitation, depending on circumstances. The furniture mill where Penland worked operated outside incorporated municipal boundaries. No school district claimed jurisdiction. No labor inspector visited the facility. The operation existed in administrative limbo where laws were theoretical rather than practical constraints. Gentry's investigation revealed that operations like Calvin Farley's boarding house served a specific function in this ecosystem. They provided housing for transient workers, including children who had been separated from families through poverty, abandonment, or deliberate sale. The boarding houses connected these vulnerable individuals with employers who asked no questions about age, family connection, or how someone had come to be available for work. The system was not organized crime in any formal sense. It was simply opportunistic exploitation built on the failures of social safety nets and the vast distances that separated remote industrial sites from effective governmental oversight. Whether Calvin Farley had paid Virgil Ducker for his daughters, or whether some other arrangement had facilitated the transfer, could not be determined from available evidence. But the connection seemed clear. Constance Farley had moved into Virgil's cabin. Her brother operated a boarding house that supplied child workers to mills. Twin girls matching Ida and Opal's description had appeared at one such mill within weeks of the Ducker twins' disappearance. The uncomfortable truth was that the twins had likely been sold into a system of labor that operated beyond legal scrutiny, worked in conditions that violated child protection laws, and then vanished again when the mill relocated or when their usefulness ended. The modified shoes that proved Ida and Opal Ducker survived their disappearance were destroyed in a courthouse fire on November 8, 1937, eliminating the only physical evidence that the twins had ever existed beyond their father's vague report. Sheriff Gentry's investigation reached its limits by the summer of 1914. Virgil Ducker could not be located in Evansville, Indiana. No employment records, no residential listings, no trace of his presence appeared in any official documentation. Either he had provided a false destination when selling his property, or he had moved again after reaching Indiana, disappearing into the vast population of men who drifted between cities doing casual labor. Constance Farley proved equally untraceable. She had no property in her name, no known relatives willing to acknowledge her whereabouts. The connection to Calvin Farley seemed certain, but Calvin himself had vanished from Tennessee as thoroughly as his sister had disappeared from Kentucky. The furniture mill where Ruth Penland had seen the twin girls working relocated 3 times between 1912 and 1914. Each move meant new workers, new housing arrangements, new informal agreements that existed outside any official record-keeping. Mills in unincorporated territory operated on cash transactions and verbal contracts. Children who worked there left no paper trail. Gentry sent inquiries to law enforcement across 4 states, asking them to watch for Virgil Ducker, Constance Farley, Calvin Farley, or 2 girls matching the twins' description. Most sheriffs responded with variations of the same message. Transient populations made tracking specific individuals nearly impossible without more concrete information. Thousands of men named Virgil worked manual labor. Hundreds of women named Constance moved between boarding houses and domestic service positions. Twin girls were common enough that descriptions based on age and general appearance meant little. The investigation produced a comprehensive record of systemic failure rather than answers about individual fate. It documented how children could disappear into informal labor systems that spanned state boundaries and operated beyond regulatory reach. It showed how poverty, isolation, and administrative gaps created conditions where exploitation flourished without consequence. But it did not find Ida and Opal Ducker. The shoes remained the only definitive proof that the twins had survived long enough to wear through industrial modifications designed for extended use. The initials carved inside confirmed identity. The wear patterns documented months of labor. The careful placement beneath the limestone overhang suggested someone had wanted them found eventually. Why the shoes ended up on Lonesome Ridge, 14 miles from the Ducker cabin and far from any known mill operation, became a question that generated theories but no verifiable answers. Some investigators speculated the twins had escaped from wherever they were being held, making it partway toward home before meeting some final tragedy. The shoes left behind might represent a last conscious act, evidence placed where it would eventually be discovered. Others suggested the shoes were disposed of by someone involved in the twins' exploitation, hidden in remote territory to eliminate evidence but preserved by chance beneath protective stone. A darker possibility held that the twins had been taken to Lonesome Ridge deliberately, that something had happened there that ended their story, and that the shoes were all that remained. Without bodies, without witnesses, without any contemporary accounts of what occurred on that ridge, the truth remained inaccessible. The courthouse fire that destroyed the shoes in 1937 also eliminated most of the case file Gentry had compiled. Some documents survived in copies held by newspaper archives or private correspondence. But the comprehensive investigation with its witness statements and accumulated evidence burned along with hundreds of other cases stored in the evidence room. By the time historians began studying child labor practices in Appalachian industrial operations decades later, the Ducker case existed only as scattered references in newspaper articles and fragmentary records. The shoes that had prompted the investigation were gone. The people involved were dead or lost to history. What remained was a pattern documented across dozens of similar cases from the same era. Children disappeared from impoverished families. They reappeared briefly in the informal labor systems that served remote industries. Then they vanished again, leaving questions that outlived anyone who might have answered them. Ida and Opal Ducker became statistics in studies of child exploitation during the early 20th century. Their names appeared in academic papers analyzing the failures of labor law enforcement in rural areas. Researchers used their case to illustrate how geographic isolation and bureaucratic limitations created environments where vulnerable children existed beyond the protection of legal systems designed to safeguard them. But as individuals, as two 8-year-old girls who were last seen wearing cloth shoes unsuitable for winter, they remained ghosts. No graves marked their passing. No family members preserved their memory. The census that had once listed them as existing could not account for where they went or when they ceased to exist. The modified shoes suggested they worked somewhere, probably for Calvin Farley's network of boarding houses and mill operations, probably under conditions that violated every child protection law on the books. They survived long enough to wear through industrial reinforcements, which meant months at minimum, possibly longer. Where they ended up after Ruth Penland last saw them in late 1912, no one could say. Whether they died from industrial accident, disease, exposure, or deliberate violence remained unknown. Whether they escaped, were sold again to a different operation, or simply aged into adult anonymity in some distant state could not be determined. The shoes, arranged carefully beneath limestone on Lonesome Ridge, represented the closest anyone came to solving what happened to the Ducker twins. They proved survival. They suggested exploitation. They hinted at stories that would never be fully told. In 1937, when those shoes burned in a courthouse fire, the last physical connection to Ida and Opal Ducker disappeared. What remained was permanent uncertainty, questions that would outlive everyone who had asked them. Some truths are simply lost. Some children vanish so completely that even their suffering becomes theoretical, documented in patterns rather than personal testimony. The Ducker twins joined countless others whose names appeared briefly in records before fading into the gaps where history could not follow. The shoes were proof of life. That was all they were. That was all they could ever be. And now even that proof was gone. If this story disturbed you, and if it made you think about the children who fall through the cracks of systems designed to protect them, then like this video. If you believe these stories need to be told, that history's darkest chapters deserve examination rather than silence, then subscribe to this channel. We dig into the cases that others forget, the tragedies that get filed away, the truths that make us uncomfortable, because remembering is the only justice some victims will ever receive. The Ducker twins deserve at least that much. So do all the others whose stories still wait to be told.